farmers used to, back, if you look between the time of the Civil War and say the 1930s, 20s and 30s, farmers used to go into their field, they'd plant the corn, they'd select out certain ears that looked good, and then they'd use that to replant the next year. And that's in the open pollinated days, before hybrid corn.
And so an open pollinated variety is any one that breeds true to type. So if you grow a population of plants, save seed from them, plant that seed out next year, the child population is going to look like or have the same biological traits and characters as the parent population.
Virtually all vegetables were open pollinated until hybridization was instigated. And most of the hybrid vegetables didn't start until the early part of the 1900s. In the 1800s, everything was open pollinated. That simply means that they come true from seed. They're stabilized varieties that come true from seed from year to year, whereas the hybrid seeds are two lines crossed together.
A genetically modified seed is one that's developed for farmers that has an added trait that comes from outside the corn plant or outside the soybean plant. Typically, this involves inserting a gene inside the plant to give it greater value.
Today's plants are threatened by lots of things. As an example, they're threatened by insects and disease. And that's true of all of us, not just plants. So there are threats out there, and we just need to figure out how to adjust to them, eliminate them, or learn to live with them.
Well, we would not introduce these traits, these products into the marketplace without external reviews in terms of both efficacy and safety. And what we do before we introduce a product into the marketplace is run it through extensive federal reviews by federal regulatory agencies to check for their safety. In the case of insect resistance, it is reviewed by the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, for safety. It is reviewed by the USDA for efficacy and safety. And it is also reviewed by the Environmental Protection Agency. So when you have an insect-resistant trait, it is reviewed by 3 government agencies in terms of efficacy and safety.
None of them are specific to one area. So like the EPA is going to look at, like corn with the BT product, to say, is that a safe material going out into the environment? Whereas the USDA is going to look at it more from the perspective of, can we use it in the fields? And the FDA is going to look at it, can people consume it?
That a lot of people don't realize the extent to which these companies go through in order to evaluate the safety of these products. And essentially the food themselves, there's no difference. It's simply involved in the production process.
Most of the genetically modified seeds were already hybrids, which meant that they'd been bred to be more disease resistant, insect resistant, drought tolerant, heat tolerant, water tolerant. All these different issues of growing plants, they've already been bred for that. Well, then when you take that gene from something else to give them one more advantage, it might make them easier for the producers to produce. And that's one of the things that in food production, mass production of the plants, that's what the farmers are looking for. How can I have a row of corn that's all the same so that when I go to harvest, it's easier, it's more profitable? That's the whole goal.
Within the U.S., biotech traits, biotech plants are pretty popular among farmers. I would estimate that in soybeans, about 95% of soybeans, 96% of soybeans contain a biotech trait. And that trait there are a number of them, but by far the most popular is Roundup Ready. In corn, I would say it's in the 90% plus area, but we know that there are transgenic traits, biotech traits that we can introduce that can help the corn and soybean plant work still better in drought environments. So there will be droughts in the coming years. We know they happen. If they don't happen on a national basis, they happen on a regional basis. So our scientists are working on drought-tolerant hybrids that really help the corn plant and the soybean plant thrive even in drier environments.
That's one of the issues with the genetically modified plants is it's difficult sometimes to figure out, is this going to be beneficial or not? And what's in reality, that's true for all breeding programs. You might find out you're trying to breed for hybrids, as an example, and find out that didn't work. Well, you just spent a lot of time and resources and it didn't work for you. The same thing's going to be true of the GMOs. You may have this gene and you think this is going to work really great, and once you really start getting it into production, you find out, nope, there's another problem on the other side. One of those was, I know that they were breeding a rice plant that they put a gene in there to make it more productive, but it made it put off a different protein that more people were allergic to. So that's one of the issues that, okay, you've got to look at the whole plant.
Soybeans are not developed through hybridization. They're developed because soybeans are known as what we call self-pollinating. So if you plant a generation of soybeans and then you follow it, and then you take that seed, you can replant it physically, and then you get the same variety, but you can't replant it legally. There's a difference there.
I think one of the misconceptions is that it's going to change people and animals and our environment, and it's going to have some effect. There's no doubt about it. But as far as that plant going out and changing other plants, unless they crossbreed, it can't happen. So it's not like if an animal ingests this plant that it's going to change that animal's DNA. That's not what's going to happen. That animal's going to ingest it. It's going to break down just like it normally does and get used. If we ingest it, our stomach acids are going to break it down and we're going to digest it and eat it. And that's where the GMOs or heirloom, once it's going into your body through that digestive system, it's pretty much what it's going to be. It's food. I know that one of the issues is that people would start using, they'd be monocropping. So if you used corn that was Roundup Ready, and then right behind that you planted, the next year planted beans that was Roundup Ready, all you're using is Roundup. Well, since all you're using is Roundup for your herbicide, what plants out there for weeds might become resistant to it. And I know that there are instances around the country where we do have some weeds that are becoming resistant to some of our pesticides, some of our herbicides.
There are many risks with growing things in monoculture. I think we need look no further than the Irish potato famine as a classic example of what happens when we rely too heavily on one crop.
The original idea, which still prevails as the heart of Seed Savers today, is to create a network of backyard gardeners who have collected or had in their family old favorite vegetable varieties that have been passed along from generation to generation. We also started to discover Native American varieties that needed to be preserved. And then finally, as well, discovered that a lot of the early open pollinated, non-hybrid commercial varieties that once were popular were being dropped by seed companies, and we were losing that genetic diversity as well. So out of all of this grew the understanding that if we don't save all of this wonderful diversity in our food supply, it simply disappears. And extinction, as you know, is forever.
The real issue, from my perspective, is that Seed Savers Exchange works with open source. The parallel between open source software and open source seed is fairly direct. We want to take what thousands of people have done over many generations of creating these wonderful varieties we've inherited and continue to share them in the way and in the spirit in which we were given them.
The definition of heirloom is a little up in the air because it's a little bit like the word antique. You know, if you're talking about furniture, well, how old does something have to be an antique? In general, they're older varieties, whatever that means. They tend to be in common usage today, the varieties that were passed along as family varieties from generation to generation. But the term also has come to apply to the older commercial varieties that were developed through traditional plant breeding methods in the late 1800s and up until, say, about the middle of the 1900s, that are really old, good commercial varieties that we think of those as heirlooms as well. The most important advantage about growing these old varieties is that many of them are more genetically diverse than modern varieties. They especially the family heirlooms that have been passed along, often with hundreds, if not thousands of years of history behind them, tend to represent really diverse gene pools, which contribute to the versatility, flexibility, and survivability of our food crops. I didn't know anything about genetic preservation and why it was important until I came to Seed Savers and got involved in the science behind it. Now I understand the absolute necessity of preserving a broad gene pool in our food supply. This is what gene banks do, and we have a gene bank here as well. When you grow and save seed and just put it away in a gene bank, the vegetables are not out there in a variety of environments exposed to changing conditions and evolving. And so we call this ex situ preservation, where basically we're preserving varieties out of their environmental context. In situ is what goes on out on the farm. It's what's been going on for thousands of years, where varieties have evolved, differently all over the world because of different people's taste and what they've selected and different weather conditions they've been adapted to, different diseases they've developed resistance to. And that's, of course, the best genetic preservation. Seed storage, those seeds are usually, professionally grown, professionally dried down to a proper moisture content so they can be put in deep freeze storage, because seeds last the longest if they can be kept the coldest. So most gene banks keep their basic stock frozen for long periods of time. And if they're properly handled in that way, many seeds can last for many, many decades without having to be regrown again. But that's part of the problem, because you're arresting their development, so they're not evolving out in the field if they're only being grown every 50 years or something. In the home garden, for instance, or even on a farm, diversity is your best hedge against disaster. If all of your eggs are in one basket, you have a bad year, you have a crop infestation of some kind, of pests or diseases, you can be wiped out. You have a wide variety in your garden, every year is going to be good for something, even if it's bad for something else. You can move genes from a nut tree into a vegetable, for instance, and this has been done before people realized that folks who are allergic to nuts are just as allergic to a vegetable that simply has one nut gene in it. So this was one of the first health risks that came out of GMOs, was when we realized that moving genes around had consequences. What's really going on here is that this is about corporate control of agriculture. The GMO revolution is all about wanting to make sure that the giant corporations who manufacture these genetically modified, patented foods, they are the only source of the seeds. And not only that, they're not only the only source of those varieties, they're the source of the genes. They patented that, and so if those genes show up anywhere else, they're the owners of it. We need to be in control of our own genetic food base. We need to be in control of our own food supply. It's a birthright. Growing your own food, having control over your own food is a birthright, just like clean air and clean water. These are birthrights. Some of the positives of GMOs, for instance, are that by breeding crops resistant to an insect pest, for instance, it requires then less insecticides to grow that crop in the field. Sounds like a good idea up front, but the trouble is, for instance, the corn that has Bt in it, Bacillus thuringiensis genes, which controls caterpillars. That's to prevent corn rootworm, for instance, in corn.